sharp, and those of you who attended or joined our lectures in the past are aware that we like to cast off exactly on time. So at the outset, allow me to welcome all of you on behalf of the India Habitat Center and the Society for Policy Studies. Today's lecture is a continuation of what we had identified or described as the Changing Asia series. And some of you have attended earlier lectures, and Mr. Shyam Saran had, in a way, sort of helped us to get the series off the ground. And we are coming back to visit a subject or a theme that I think most of you are reasonably aware of and familiar with. It's been doing the rounds for some time. 10 years of the Indo-US Civilian Nuclear Agreement. To be very exact, it was signed on the 18th of July in 2005. And I can see many people in the audience who were part of that effort at that time. And it seemed most appropriate that we should have one of the principal players, if you will, at that time, Ambassador Saran was the Foreign Secretary, to look back and perhaps give us an overview about how do we assess July 2005. Now in this very room, I know from 2005 to now, 10 years ago, we had discussed various aspects of not only the India-US relationship, but India's own strategic orientation. And I think it would be fair to remind ourselves, if you will, that July 2005 was preceded by June 2005, which was the agreement signed between our then Defense Minister and now the Honorable President, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, and Mr. Donald Rumsfeld, who was then the US Secretary of Defense. And in a way, June 2005 and July 2005 actually need to be seen as complementing each other. And a lot of water has flown under the bridge, and we have many accounts about what happened on both sides. And some of our more distinguished authors are here. I want to recognize Mr. Rajamohan, Dr. Rajamohan, who's written on that subject and who again has another mini opus on India's foreign policy. There are accounts about what happened on the US side, some substantive and some, I would say, on specific niches. So I'd like to thank Ambassador Shyam Saran for finding the time to revisit July 2005. And we often say that we introduce our speakers and say that so-and-so does not need an introduction. So today I shall not make the introduction except to say Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, former Special Envoy to the Prime Minister, currently Chairman of the RIS. And I think above all, he's been a good friend of the SPS and the Habitat Center. So on that note, may I request you, sir, take your remarks, please.
Uday, thank you very much for that introduction. Good evening to all of you, and welcome to this evening's event. I'm very gratified that we have almost a full house this evening, despite the weather. It has been pointed out by Uday that there were a number of things that really converged together before we came on to the civil nuclear agreement. Actually, July 18th, 2005 was not really the agreement itself, but in a sense the intention to conclude this agreement. But we have now almost invariably talk about the July 18 statement as the nuclear deal. Let me first of all, of course, begin by thanking the Society for Policy Studies and the India Habitat Center for inviting me once again to deliver a lecture under their very prestigious Changing Asia series. This series actually has been a very useful initiative, which has been, of course, the architect of that has been Uday himself. Because it has been useful in fostering, public debate, some reasoned discourse on issues of interest in terms of strategy, in terms of foreign policy, something that really is required today, as India's own engagement with the rest of the world in fact expands. The subject that I would be talking about today is not to sort of give you a storyline with respect to the India-US nuclear deal. I think a lot of material has already come out about how that story unfolded. I thought it would be much more worthwhile perhaps to share with you some of my own, shall I say, takeaways or learnings from that process, because to my mind, it was a rather unusual and unprecedented kind of a diplomatic effort. And I also believe that there are lessons to be learned from the way in which this deal was negotiated. There were positive lessons, but there were also some negative lessons that we need to perhaps appreciate. So it's 10 years now. If one considers the storm and thunder which attended its birth, the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement appears to have receded somewhat from public consciousness in just a span of 10 years. It was a deal which some regarded as providing India the veritable keys of the kingdom. Others condemned it as a dangerous trap designed to deprive India of its much wanted political independence, as well as its family jewels in the shape of its indigenous strategic program. Today, it sits comfortably as an enabling asset, taken mostly for granted, I think, in India's diplomatic toolkit. Exaggerated expectations may have been belied, but those predicting imminent doom have mostly turned to scoffing at what they see as meager pickings, rather than lamenting the bitter harvest that, according to them, we should have reaped by now. A similar spectrum of positive and negative perceptions were to be found in Washington. Those opposing the deal saw it as a wrecking ball, demolishing the nuclear non-proliferation edifice and handing India a trophy which it really did not deserve. The supporters saw the deal as the anointment of India as America's ally, ready to align itself to America's direction. And American business saw the deal as opening the door to India's expanding market, not the least in the civil nuclear field. The bandwidth, as it were, between the two ends of the spectrum, as neither doom nor gloom, in a sense, have come to pass. The pendulum still swings a decade later this way and that, and certainly among the ranks of Washington's think tanks. But there too, I was there recently in Washington, the Indo-US nuclear deal mostly enjoys an afterglow of a historic agreement. 10 years provides just enough distance to revisit the nuclear deal and attempt a more balanced and sober assessment. My involvement in the negotiating process from start to finish was intense. There were moments of elation when an unexpected breakthrough was achieved. There was dark despair when odds appeared to be insuperable. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, one begins to see the same highs and lows from a more rounded perspective, and as a flow with its own logic, rather than as a series of discrete, disconnected moments. My first observation is that the Indo-US nuclear deal was both a reflection of the major transformation in Indo-US relations since the end of the Cold War, as also a driver of that further transformation. The realignment of major power relations in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union began a process of transforming Indo-US relations from estrangement to engagement and a growing awareness of shared interests. Neither side would have been able to contemplate such a significant departure from their established positions in a sensitive area such as the nuclear domain if they had not already achieved a fair degree of congruence in their respective strategic perspectives as well as mutual confidence. I see this process of growing convergence accelerating with the 14 rounds of talks between the then US Deputy Secretary of State, Stuart Talbot, and India's Jaswant Singh, who later served as Foreign Minister. These talks were held between June 1998 and July 2000 and focused on how the two countries should manage the fallout from the May 1998 nuclear tests undertaken by India. These talks were inconclusive, but they did establish that the United States would no longer aim to, and in the words of Stuart Talbot himself, quote, put the genie back in the bottle, as US now accepted the reality of India as a de facto nuclear weapon state. Indian confidence in the US was bolstered by the latter's reaction to Pakistan's Kargil adventure in May, July 1999. The US categorically, for the first time, endorsed the inviolability of the line of control and successfully pressured Pakistan to vacate the areas it had occupied on the Indian side of the LOC. India was henceforth effectively dehyphenated from Pakistan in US calculations. The Talbot-Jaswant talks and the US support in the Kargil episode created a positive enough environment to enable President Clinton's successful visit to India in March 2000, when the sanctions imposed on India after the nuclear tests were also lifted. India's unambiguous support to the US after the tragic events of 9/11 in 2001, and the sense it created of the two liberal democracies being on the same side in the global war on terror, the endorsement of President Bush's ballistic missile defense initiative, and the visible prospects of a democratic India finally beginning to deliver on its immense economic promise formed the backdrop of the next major initiative in respect of the nuclear deal, which is the, quote, next steps in strategic partnership, which were announced in January 2004. The NSSP, as it became known, detailed a series of reciprocal steps which would allow limited but nevertheless significant bilateral cooperation in the nuclear and space areas after a hiatus of several decades, and also clear the decks for supply of sensitive and dual-use technologies and initiate possible discussions on cooperation in ballistic missile defense. In this context, India committed itself to aligning its export control regime with the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime. It also agreed to enact legislation to give effect to its commitment under UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which dealt with the spread of WMD-related technologies. India passed its comprehensive WMD Act in May 2005. The revised export control lists were also shared with the US. These steps led the two countries to announce in July 2005, in advance of Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's visit to Washington, that they had successfully concluded the NSSP. And there is another development which is worth taking into account, and that is the close cooperation between the naval forces of India, US, Australia, and Japan in December 2004, January 2005, to render assistance to countries in South and Southeast Asia after the tsunami struck several countries, causing extensive death and devastation. Indian naval forces were able to deliver prompt and substantial relief to countries far away from its shores. To the US and its partners, India had established itself as a significant security provider in the Asia Pacific region. India began to be seen as an indispensable partner in coping with the emerging security challenges in the region, in particular the rapid emergence of China as a power with major economic and military capabilities. This then is the backdrop of the historic July 18th Indo-US joint statement, which committed the two countries to resume, quote, full civil nuclear cooperation, unquote. The nuclear deal should be seen as a culmination of a process of intense dialogue and engagement in the aftermath of the Indian nuclear tests of May 1998, which first interrupted, but then accelerated the transformation of Indo-US ties that was already taking place since the end of the Cold War. The deal was made possible by the growing strategic congruence between the two countries. It did not create that congruence, but certainly enhanced it. My second observation relates to the negotiating process itself. These negotiations were unique in many ways. They were mandated by the leaders of the two countries and undertaken by negotiators answerable to them. This was a top-down process, and one in which the leaders remained involved and often intervened to achieve what they had set out to. I wish to enumerate at least 3 occasions. There were several others, but I would like to enumerate these 3 because they are significant in their own way. These were occasions on which the personal intervention of Prime Minister Dr. Singh and President Bush helped overcome what may have appeared at the time as really insuperable obstacles. The first instance relates to the events leading up to July 18, 2005 itself. It may be recalled that the US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, visited India in March of that year to prepare for the Prime Minister's visit to the US. It is during this visit that the US committed itself to clearing the decks for the resumption of bilateral cooperation in civil nuclear energy, thereby seeking to remove the often bitter and negative legacy of the past. It was considered necessary to remove this negative legacy to enable India and the United States to work on the larger strategic sort of congruence that I mentioned to you earlier. For India to emerge as a partner to the US, it was clear it could no longer be treated as a target. In order to negotiate the principles on which such cooperation could be resumed and the practical steps that would need to be taken reciprocally in this regard, a negotiating group was set up, headed by the US Under-Secretary of State, Nick Burns, and myself on the Indian side as Foreign Secretary. In the ensuing 2 months, there were difficult, sometimes acrimonious negotiations over that one key section of the proposed joint statement to be issued on civil nuclear cooperation to be issued during the Prime Minister's visit to Washington. The final touches were still being worked out in the days preceding the visit in meetings that took place in the US Capitol. A few loose ends remained, and these were sought to be tied up in an important meeting that Condoleezza Rice had with Shri Natwar Singh, the then External Affairs Ministers, in the afternoon of July 17. The Prime Minister met his full delegation that same evening to consider our handiwork. This was not a pleasant meeting. Some objected to the very idea of having such an agreement with the US. Others objected to specific formulations which seemed to detract from India's status as a nuclear weapon state. The end result was that the Prime Minister decided against the inclusion of this section in the joint statement. I was asked to convey this to my counterpart and to suggest anodyne kind of wording committing the two sides to continue deliberations on civil nuclear cooperation. The reaction from the US side was, of course, one of great disappointment. Early next morning, I received a call from Nick Burns to convey that Secretary Rice wished to have an urgent meeting with her Prime Minister at Blair House, where the latter was staying. Dr. Singh was reluctant to meet her and asked Shri Natwar Singh to receive her instead. When Rice arrived, she persuaded Natwar Singh to take her to the PM, as she had a very important message, she said, to convey from President Bush himself. During this meeting, she conveyed the President's keen desire to clinch this historic deal and expressed her willingness to take on board Indian concerns relating to the formulations in the joint statement. Dr. Singh then asked the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Dr. Kapotkar to give in writing what changes he would like to see in the wording so as to allay some of the concerns that he had expressed. Kapotkar did so reluctantly. These were shown to Rice, who said that they could perhaps be worked into the text appropriately. She asked whether we could go ahead with the joint statement if the two sides could reach agreement on the new text. Encouraged by Natwar Singh, whose constructive role is perhaps not always recognized, Dr. Singh actually gave his assent. He did not consult all the other members of the delegation in doing so. If he had, maybe he would not have been able to give his assent. There followed yet another round of negotiations between Burns and myself, and there were some fresh objections coming this time from the US side, because some of their people from the Energy Department, State Department then looked at the suggested wording and were not happy about it at all. We had not finished our negotiations even while the two principals went in for the summit meeting. So when they went in for the summit meeting, it was still not clear whether we would actually be able to come out with a joint statement with this paragraph. Eventually, just before the summit ended, we wrapped up our meeting with a final text ready to be announced at the ensuing press conference. That is how the joint statement containing this paragraph came about. The second instance relates to India's separation plan, by which we had agreed to list the nuclear plants which would fall in the civilian category and those which would be in the strategic or non-civilian category. This was necessary in order to ensure that whatever we received through cooperation with the US would not be diverted to military use. Only the civilian reactors would be offered under voluntary safeguards under the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. The US held that once the civilian nuclear facilities went under safeguards, then they would remain permanently, even if fuel supplies were terminated for any reason. Our position was that safeguards would be accepted only so long as fuel supplies continued uninterrupted. We did not wish to face the kind of disruption which had affected the Tarapur plant, which continued to be under safeguards even though the US had seized fuel supplies post the 1974 nuclear test fire. After President Bush arrived in Delhi on March 5, we began a final round of negotiations to overcome this issue. The US was adamant that safeguards would have to be permanent, while we countered by saying that without assurance of permanent and uninterrupted supplies, we could not accept this. Despite several hours of talks stretching well beyond midnight, we were unable to square the circle. The fate of the separation plan thus hung in balance. The next morning at Hyderabad House, even while the principals commenced their summit meeting, just as it had happened in Washington, we had a repeat performance, another meeting was scheduled among senior officials, which included the National Security Advisor, Shyam Saran, and myself on the Indian side. And of course, there were other officials as well. And the US NSA, Steve Hadley, and Nick Burns on the American side. At this meeting, Hadley conveyed to us the fuel supply assurances which he said President Bush himself had approved. And the critical element of this was the entitlement of the Indian side to maintain fuel supply reserves to last the lifetime of each of our reactors. You might have seen a news item this morning about the government's plan to build up a strategic reserve of fuel for our nuclear power program. Yeah, in fact, in a sense, it is a direct result of with this particular provision. On this basis, the Department of Atomic Energy did come on board, and the separation plan was announced after the summit meeting. The multi-layered fuel supply assurances were incorporated in toto in the plan and reiterated in the eventual 123 agreement subsequently. As far as I'm aware, no other country has such an entitlement written into a legal instrument. The third instance of leadership intervention relates to the issue of reprocessing of spent fuel. India wanted an upfront and permanent entitlement to reprocess spent fuel derived from foreign origin nuclear fuel. This was flatly refused initially, but finally conceded after Dr. Singh personally took it up with President Bush on the sidelines of one of the multilateral meetings. This was incorporated in the 123 agreement, but on condition that the reprocessing would take place in a separate dedicated facility under IAEA safeguards and subject to certain administrative arrangements being worked out. I understand that these have been concluded only recently, but the facility, of course, has still to be built. I have cited these instances to underscore the fact that the negotiations leading up to the deal benefited from the personal involvement of the leaders of the two countries. And without their intervention at critical junctures, I doubt that we would have been successful. Now, my third observation relates to the critical role of practical diplomacy in mobilizing support for the deal. And this, in many ways, was a very new and learning experience for both sides. This was the first time that Indian diplomats reached out directly to US senators and congressmen seeking support for the deal. I must have made several rounds of the Capitol Hill, spending hours persuading skeptics and enthusing those positively inclined. The embassy in Washington and the then Ambassador Rollin Sen were equally active in this respect. This was also the first time that the influential Indian American community was mobilized in such a focused effort to line up US congressional support behind the deal. A parallel effort was made with the US business community as well. And here too, I must acknowledge the role played by Rollin Sen and his able colleagues in the Indian mission. The US fielded an outstanding team on its side. My early conversations in Washington were with Phil Zelikow, counselor in the State Department, already well known for his bold strategic thinking. When I mentioned to you the aspect of strategic congruence between the two countries, which was the backdrop to our being able to take forward this particular initiative, it was in these conversations that we really brought about, in a sense, a awareness of that commonality of interest. Commonality of interest in terms of how India looks at the changes that have taken place in the geopolitical landscape. How does India look at its own role 10 years from now, 20 years from now? How does the US look at its role, transformed role, with the kind of realignment that was taking place among the major powers? And it is in these conversations that we really came to the conclusion that in the long term, India-US interests are likely to be more aligned than in fact they were today. And therefore it made sense for the two countries to really clear the decks for that kind of working together of the two sides for common objectives. So as I said, we spent several hours exchanging views on the rapidly changing Asian and international order and what might be our shared interest in dealing with the change scenarios. Most of the subsequent negotiations were with Nick Burns, who pursued his mandate with dogged persistence. And his successor, Bill Burns, was a reassuring presence and a source of support when the going really got tough at the nuclear suppliers group. The Indian team also appreciated the role played by Ashley Tellis, who helped smooth many a prickly standoff between the two sides. After the bilateral deal with the US had been successfully concluded, an even more complex set of negotiations had to be undertaken with the 48-member nuclear suppliers group in order to ensure a waiver for India from its own rules and guidelines. The US undoubtedly helped but much of the burden again fell on Indian diplomacy. Since the NSG works by consensus, our challenge was all the more daunting. Sometime in 2007, I began to concentrate more on the NSG, leaving it to Foreign Secretary Menon to handle the bilateral track. As Prime Minister's Special Envoy, I must have traveled several thousand miles, visiting countries like Japan, ROK, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, persuading mostly skeptical interlocutors that India deserved their support for an India-specific waiver without accepting any constraint on its strategic program. In summit meetings the Prime Minister held with his counterparts, this message was of course reinforced. In Vienna itself, our lobbying was relentless, sometimes frustrating, sometimes encouraging. Foreign Secretary Menon interacted with members of the NSG, arguing India's case persuasively, answering questions patiently. Away from the scene, the two NSAs, Narayanan and Steve Hadley, worked the phones and helped in facilitating the final consensus decision. But eventually the prize was in hand on September 8 when the nuclear suppliers group adopted a consensus decision on giving India a clean waiver from its route, that is without conditions. India had finally made a successful re-entry into the international civilian nuclear market. There is a perception that China played a blocking role at the nuclear suppliers group. It is true that China was opposed to the waiver, but preferred to encourage the smaller countries who had very rigid positions on non-proliferation to take the lead in proposing killer amendments to the draft decision. On September 8, when it became clear that the last holdouts were going to vote in favor of the waiver, the Chinese mission in Vienna sent a written communication to our delegation at the hotel early in the morning, conveying that China had decided to support the draft decision as formulated. They thus avoided being the last country to convey support. My purpose in conveying these details is to underscore the importance of traditional diplomacy in advancing India's interests. Much of this work requires patience, perseverance, and hard work away from the spotlight. This is where professional skills matter, and I have no hesitation in saying that the team I had the privilege to work with, including Jay Shankar, who is the current Foreign Secretary, and later Gayatri Kumar, who is sitting here in front of me, among several others, would rate among the very best in the world. My fourth observation relates to a principle which is applicable in most negotiating scenarios, but is often lost sight of. Before engaging in negotiations, it is important to have a clear mandate and red lines that must not be crossed. Knowing what the bottom line is gives the negotiator the flexibility to compromise and confidence in insisting what cannot be conceded. We were fortunate that in these negotiations, the mandate given to us was clear and unambiguous. The brief given to us by the then Prime Minister was that, of course, we should seek the dismantling of technology denial regimes which were limiting our developmental prospects. We should aim to reintegrate India into the international civil nuclear market as a fully entitled member, and achieve this without accepting any constraint whatsoever on India's strategic weapons program. When the Hyde Act was passed, there was considerable controversy over its provisions. Some pretty gratuitous, others prescriptive. However, what persuaded us to continue with the process was that the law gave India permanent and unconditional waivers from the key provisions of the US Atomic Energy Act, which stipulate that the US cannot engage in civil nuclear cooperation, one, with a state which has exploded a nuclear explosive device. And of course, India had done so as recently as May 1998. Second, with a state engaged in the production of nuclear explosive devices currently, which India is engaged in as a nuclear weapon state. And three, with a state which does not have all its nuclear facilities under full scope international safeguards, which again, of course, India did not, since several of its facilities would be in the non-civilian, non-safeguarded category. These explicit waivers outweighed some of the other onerous provisions in the Act and became the basis of the clean waiver we were subsequently able to get from the industry. Another instance of a red line that was successfully defended was in respect of the separation of civilian from non-civilian nuclear facilities. The US initially insisted that this must include the separation of personnel as well, and this would be subject to verification. That is, those people working in the strategic program should not be able to come into the civilian field and vice versa. We said we would not accept this principle. This would have been impractical for the first, as it should be obvious. It would have required our accepting a level of intrusiveness which would have been politically unpalatable. Even hours before President Bush landed in Delhi in March 2006, this demand was repeated again and again with the implicit threat that it could become a deal breaker. It was the confidence and assurance with which one declined this demand which led, I think, the US to drop it and never raise it again. And finally, India was able to successfully resist the demand to turn its voluntary moratorium on nuclear testing into a legal commitment, both in the bilateral context with the US and the multilateral context with the Nuclear Suppliers Group as a condition for resumption of civil nuclear cooperation. This was a clear red line from the outset in the negotiations that we never wavered from. My sixth and last observation concerns the importance of what I call strategic communications or the management of political and public perceptions. This is one area where our record could have been better. We were unable to persuasively convey the benefits of the deal, tangible as well as intangible. This was partly due to the complex nature of the subject itself, but also because within the ruling coalition itself, there were strongly skeptical views about the unfolding partnership with the United States. Opposition to the deal was not so much on its merits than as reflective of the continuing suspicion of the United States. The failure of strategic communications may also be seen in the rather inept manner in which the issue of civil nuclear liability law was handled, and which created a legal mess which the US President Obama and Prime Minister Modi bravely tried to untangle during their summit in January this year. The Convention on Supplementary Compensation for Nuclear Damage under the IAEA had been in negotiation for several years and had actually no connection with the Indo-US nuclear deal to begin with. In fact, the protocol on this was adopted as early as 1997, much before India and the US had any intention of resuming civil nuclear cooperation, though the convention has come into force only now. It was an initiative taken after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster to ensure the speedy delivery of relief and compensation to victims of any future accident. It was agreed that the plant operator would carry the financial responsibility to distribute relief up to a certain predetermined limit to those affected without waiting for the results of any investigation. Countries establishing such arrangements through domestic legislation would then be entitled to draw supplementary relief from an international fund contributed to by countries with significant nuclear facilities and administered by the IAEA under this convention. Thus, in order to sign up to the supplementary convention, all that was required was a simple enabling domestic legislation, making the operator liable financially to distribute relief in the first instance and to indicate the limit to which it would do so. The financial liability cannot be open-ended, since it could not then be covered through insurance. Once the financial liability is fixed, the operator would take out insurance for that amount, and the premium would be passed on through increased tariff. Therefore, the limit would have to take into account the impact on the economic viability of the nuclear power business. This legislation had a limited purpose of enabling participation in the supplementary convention. It was not expected to deal with the issue of supplier liability. The latter is usually dealt with in a commercial contract, and in fact has been in the past. Instead of educating political parties and public opinion on this background, the government let itself be pressured into accepting provisions which went far beyond the original rationale for this legislation. It allowed the impression to take hold that another Bhopal tragedy would befall us without stringent and far-reaching legal provisions. In fact, the original purpose of this legislation was precisely to avoid a Bhopal-like situation by ensuring immediate and unconditional relief. The mess was further compounded by the law indicating an additional government liability of 1,000 crores. However, the government's liability towards its citizens affected by disaster is unlimited. It cannot be that the government will stop giving relief once the limit of 1,000 crores is reached. The entire exercise of passing this legislation is, to my mind, a case study of how things must not be done. Hopefully, this is behind us now. So what did the nuclear deal achieve for India? Most importantly, it expanded India's strategic space, enabling it to leverage its enhanced relationship with the US to upgrade its relations with other partners. That the US was prepared to take such a major initiative with India, despite the risk to its non-proliferation objectives, put India in the category of major global players and Delhi as an indispensable destination for leaders across the globe. The deal also led to the dismantling of most of the technology denial regimes operating against India since 1974, and which had been progressively expanded to cover most dual-use items as well. Since the deal was concluded, barely 0.5% of high-tech US exports are subject to licensing. In 2005, the figure was 10%. The US lead has been followed by other major high-tech supplier countries like Japan and Germany, who of course followed the US practice. The relaxation of export controls has also led to a significant increase in defense-related trade and collaboration with the US, as well as with other partner countries, and allowed the framework agreement on defense cooperation to actually yield very, very practical results. It is true that so far deals for setting up new nuclear plants have not materialized. The nuclear liability law was an issue, but now that it has been resolved, we may begin to see some progress. Of course, one should also recognize that the prospects for more expanded nuclear program has been also impacted by the Fukushima disaster and the negative turn in public opinion within India itself. However, the deal has opened the way for India to conclude long-term supply agreements, fuel supply agreements with several countries. This has enabled capacity utilization in our nuclear plants to reach 80 to 85%, when in 2005, shortage of fuel due to NSG restrictions had pushed utilization down to as low as 30 to 35%. India is very much in the international mainstream as far as nuclear issues are concerned, despite being outside the NPT. Its membership of the NSG is being supported by the US and is likely to come through, though there are challenges which need to be overcome, again, to my mind, through very intensive diplomacy. 10 years after the deal was announced, India-US relations are stronger than they have ever been. They may not have been if the nuclear deal had not cleared the decks of the negative legacies of the past and created a culture of engagement and dialogue. As I said, the deal was being commemorated in Washington recently, and its importance was underlined by the US Vice President Biden himself attending one of the events and delivering a very important speech. What he said certainly resonates amongst those of us who are privileged to be associated with its negotiation. He observed that ultimately this deal was not so much about the nuclear issue as it was about India. It reminded me of similar remarks made to me by the Brazilian, Mexican, and South African representatives who were perhaps the last to be persuaded that they should support the NSG waiver. Just after the decision was taken on September 8th, they came to me and they conveyed their very warm congratulations on a signal achievement against very difficult odds, but added, make no mistake, this has been possible only because it was for India. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think that was a very comprehensive and useful overview of events that took place 10 years ago.
Mike, sir, Mike.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
I'm saying I'm thanking Ambassador Saran for giving us a very comprehensive and lucid overview and drawing attention, I think, to some very significant punctuations as far as the India-US Civil nuclear agreement is concerned. I like that phrase, doom and gloom, which preceded 10 years ago, and the afterglow, as he's described it in 2015. He's agreed to take a few questions, observations, so I can see many hands and I see some familiar, some not so familiar, but I'll be happy. I'll make the same request, identify yourself, and as you know, I try very often to get everybody on board and make it a question, make it an observation, and we go through the rounds. Ambassador Kumar, you have the floor. Mics will come to you. Some of you have stentorian voices, so I don't know.
Suren Kumar. Shyam, congratulations, very fascinating account. I suggest you put down this form book to be entitled The Making of Indo-US Nuclear Deal, an Insider's View. If you need a publisher, there is a publisher here, Wisdom Tree, you can publish it. It's fascinating history, and also at least B diplomats who are lampooned in the press as babus. It proved the babus also do some work, produce very big deals. But tell me, after this is history, 10 years, how do you see in concrete terms take away from the deal in next 10 years?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sanjeev?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Saran, you've outlined, what India gained from the deal, and that's sort of evident to us in India. I think more than anything else, Prime Minister Singh achieved his lasting fame less than halfway through his 10-year term. And of course, we gained entree into the world of, onto the big table. But what intrigues me is that, what did the US actually gain from going out on a limb for India? After all, in 2006 and 2007, yes, we were growing, and lots of countries grow. But we were basically a country that was muddling through as far as external relations are concerned. So why was the US so prescient in extending this waiver to India? Did they already know that Prime Minister Modi was coming along? Determined to make a go of India? What was the background to that?
Thank you very much, sir, for your very insightful and perceptive comments. Two very short questions. One is, India had to go through all this to get civilian nuclear cooperation deal, etc., etc. How would you compare this with China and Pakistan agreement in terms of supply of nuclear facility? Meaning, of course, some of them are grandfathered, but what about the new facilities and the new reactors that are going to be manufactured? And the second is about membership of NSG and other nuclear and missile control, technology control regimes. Now there also there have been some mention, there has been some mention in the press that China would like Pakistan also to come on board at the same time as as India does. And what would be your comment on that? Thank you.
You know, as far as China-Pakistan nuclear cooperation is concerned, it is of a very long-standing nature. In fact, one could even say that the Pakistani nuclear arsenal was made possible by assistance from China. There are reports that even the first test was carried out in China itself, and the design is of Chinese origin. So I think with respect to the cooperation between China and Pakistan in the nuclear field, that is something which has been an ongoing fact of life, I would say. So if somebody is suggesting that somehow the India-US nuclear deal has paved the way for closer cooperation between China and Pakistan, I don't think that is true, because it has been something which has already been there and has been continuing even today. So I do not link it with the Indo-US nuclear deal. That China was unhappy about it, that Pakistan was unhappy about it, is true. But I think what has to be recognized is that very early on the US made it very clear that this was possible for the US to consider and to persuade others in the international community to consider, because of the impeccable record of India in non-proliferation, even if it was not a member of NPT. The Pakistan does not have that history, does not have that record, and therefore the US has said in so many words that it cannot contemplate anything of a similar kind with respect to Pakistan. That continues to be the case even today. With regard to membership of the NSG, as you know, the United States has committed itself to supporting India's membership not only of the NSG but MTCR as well as the Wassenaar Group and the Australia Group, the four control regimes, export control regimes. Yes, just as I mentioned that for the NSG waiver, we had to engage in very, very difficult negotiations. We had to do a lot of hard work going around persuading members to support the waiver for India. I suspect we would have to undertake a similar exercise if we think that just having the US support us will somehow open the doors. I'm afraid it won't happen like that. It didn't happen with the NSG waiver, it would not happen with the NSG membership. So we will have to work. We will have to persuade members of the NSG to support India's membership. Is China opposed? Probably. But my own experience shows that, like with the waiver, if China becomes aware that there is a very broad spectrum of support for this initiative, China never wants to be the last country to raise its hand and say. They have mostly avoided that in the past. Maybe they might not in the future, I don't know, but that is the experience that one has. So if one is able to mobilize a critical mass of support for India's membership, and there are very good reasons why India can argue today it should be a member, I do not think that China would be the last country to actually oppose that consensus. But what I understand is that while so far we have been looking at approaching the membership of these four regimes as a package, I think there is now some thinking that maybe we should not look at it as a package, but look at each regime on its own, the segregated. And perhaps the first that may come through is maybe the MTCR, hopefully. That's what I think. With regard to why did the US go out on a limb? Maybe you should ask that question from the US, why it went out on a limb. But I mentioned to you the fact that in my remarks I said that one should not look at this as a sudden departure in policy from the US. It is actually a culmination of a number of developments that were taking place before that. Whether it was the end of the Cold War, the change in perception about India, India's change in perception, liberalization, economic reform, globalization of the Indian economy, greater engagement with the rest of the world. But the conversations that I mentioned that I had with Phil Zelikow during the early period from about December 2004 to maybe March 2005, these conversations were essentially, as I said, about what is India's worldview? How does India look at the world 20 years from now? I mentioned the fact that with regard to the change taking place in our own region, the Asia Pacific region, not only the emergence of China, that of course is a very important aspect, but it's an emergence of a number of other major powers as well. I mean, this is a region populated today by a number of major powers. How do these powers interact with one another? What is the kind of architecture that is emerging in the region? Both the security architecture as well as the economic architecture. Are India and the United States ready to work together to try and shape that architecture in line with their own interests or their perceived interests? Or is this something that is going to be shaped by others or shaped by default in a sense? If 20 years from now, India and the United States see that the world is going to belong to knowledge societies, societies which are creative, societies which are innovative, do we have strengths that we can actually put together and make sure that we are in the front ranks of that knowledge society? So there were a number of conversations of this nature in terms of how we see the future. And is there an alignment of interest between India and the US in shaping that future? And we came to the conclusion, I acknowledge, that yes, there is perhaps greater congruence in interests between the two sides going forward than perhaps we are aware of today. And if we wanted to realize that congruence and act according to that congruence, unless you clear the decks, as it were, of the negative legacy, you could not do that. There would always be a certain limit beyond which you could not go. So the sense was that if India had to be a partner, then you cannot treat India also as a target, which is what all these regimes were all about. Don't forget, the NSG was brought into existence after 1974 precisely to punish countries like India, to make an example of India, in fact, to the rest of the world. So, if we were looking at that larger sort of strategic picture, then without clearing the decks, this would not have been possible. And I believe that that must have been the reason why the US also agreed with us when we put this across, that if we want to move ahead, we have to remove this. And they agreed, yes, this has to be done. Lastly, what is going to be the next 10 years? Really depends upon what decisions we take. Nothing is preordained. But I think today you have, thanks to the nuclear deal, thanks to the defense cooperation agreement that was talked about, I think today you have a much broader relationship, much deeper relationship than you have had at any time in the past. There is no doubt that India-US relations today are at a level they have never been in the past. Therefore, with regard to the future, and if I'm looking at, again going back to the conversations that one had in 2004, 2005, the reasons why we thought India and the US should be working together, those reasons are more pressing today, are more compelling today than they were 10 years ago. Therefore, I see, in fact, a tremendous potential for us to move together. And I think Prime Minister Modi has perhaps recognized that.
I'm just debating whether we should have another title for Shyam as Professor Saran. Some of the answers are really very totally. Let me recognize, I have a lot of names. Please be brief in your questions, I'd be grateful. Commander Bhaskar, I'll go with you first, and then Mr. Bhagat, Professor Vanita Shastri, and Ms. Sally Daughtry of that. Prem Saab, you go first.
Sir, I have one nagging question in my mind. Some years back, it was written in an article that unless US takes Iran on board, Afghanistan imbroglio cannot be solved. Now, what about this Indo-US nuclear deal? Am I correct if I remember, sir, that as Bush assumed his presidency, it was said by him that he told his cabinet, you cannot have the balance of power in the world without India being without you. Would you give credit to George Bush, as he sometimes says he is incompetent and doesn't know English?
Mr. Bhagat?
Yeah, there were two very recent articles on the nuclear deal in the newspaper, one by Brahma Chalani and one by Ashley Taylor, which were diametrically opposed. I'd like to add some observations. It will take exactly 1 minute. Number one, Pokhran 2 allowed Pakistan to conduct their nuclear test on their soil. Number two, thanks to American funding and Chinese assistance, the Pakistani army, our only clear and present threat, will continue to remain actively hostile, irrespective of the nuclear deal. Number three, the Navy has indigenously developed sophisticated laser weapons without access to promised technology. We should learn from the Navy. Imported reactors are unusable because they're untested and largely and hugely expensive. Number five, import facility will only make the largely sleeping BARC, which since its heyday, go only deeper into slumber, like the DRDO and most unlike ISRO. Unless BARC works towards a breakthrough in fusion versus fission, nuclear power will become increasingly obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bhagat. Dr. Shanti White? Yeah, yes.
Thank you for your comments. I really enjoyed the fact that you did give the Indian American community some credit for, I remember very close friends doing a lot of hard work on the Capitol and writing papers and notes for them. And also, I think this is very interesting that you talk about, that very deep work, background work in context happens before a policy change comes out. And you working the senators and the congressmen or going to capitals of Japan and Brazil and Mexico. Do you think that kind of work is continuing with the ministry, or is that something that only happened because of there was a target, or is that kind of policy change, sort of work in the ministry in the Indian side has actually become a standard? Thank you.
Ms. Sally, and then I'll come back here. Sally, yeah. Well, Shashil Yame. Madam.
So, yes, thank you for a very fascinating account of this deal. My name is Sally, I'm a science diplomat. I consult for the British government and others here in Delhi and in Central Asia, mostly on science and technology agreements between different nations. You mentioned, and I was delighted to hear you mention the words knowledge society and how India sees the world in 20 years from now. I have recently, over the last 9 months, been doing some work on the UK-India research partnership in nuclear, which it's small. The British government invests presently around £7 million British pounds, very much a personal engagement between the scientists involved. And we see that as very positive for the future of UK-India relationships on this topic. So my question to you is about, when we look at this topic as a whole, is it a two-man show, or are there room for others, notably UK, France, perhaps Russia?
Thank you.
It could not be a two-man show, even if this was something which was driven by the leaders, as I said, the two top leaders. And it was to begin with India and the US. Don't forget that it was agreed right in the beginning that this could not come about, or even the US could not deliver on this unless there was NSG clearance and there was consensus amongst those 48 members. That's why I said that there were more complex negotiations getting the NSG on board than perhaps even with the United States. So to think that this is only about the United States is simply not true. It was apparent to us right from the beginning that if this was going to really make a difference with respect to India's development prospects, its aspirations, it had to be something which not only engaged the United States, but engaged other partners as well. This is why I mentioned that it was important for the US to take the lead, because others took their lead from the United States. So if the US put sanctions against India or technology denial regimes against India, it influenced others as well. So we could not, if we could not get some component from the United States, we could not get it from UK, we could not get it from Germany, we could not get it from Japan. As soon as the deal was announced, what was a presumption of denial in terms of technology became a presumption of approval. And there was really a major sort of change in the attitude of important source countries as far as science and technology is concerned. Please make no mistake that we don't see this only in the context of the United States. This is something which we, right from the beginning, looked upon as opening the doors for us internationally. With regard to comments that have been made about the slumber of the BRC or whether we should learn from the Navy, number one, I think I certainly believe that under some of the most difficult odds, the Department of Atomic Energy should be complimented about the kind of achievements that they have to date. They may have been slowed down because of these sanctions, because of the difficulties that they have, but let me tell you, all our partners, including the United States, have the highest regard for the competence or the skills of our atomic energy scientists. So I certainly do not buy the argument that the DA is asleep or the DARC is asleep. I think we should not belittle our own achievements. We should recognize that under very difficult odds, these organizations have actually made us very proud. So I do not accept that argument. Second, with regard to what is the role of collaboration, foreign collaboration, and self-reliance. This is an old debate. But even in the nuclear field, if you look at Homi Bhabha's writings, he puts a huge amount of emphasis on collaboration. He created an organization which could collaborate, cooperate with others, because that was the only way that knowledge pool in India could be expanded. So how did he see it? I think it would be very worthwhile for us to recall that. He said that, look, at the level where we are starting, we need a high degree of foreign collaboration because it is a learning experience. At each stage, our capacities increase. So at the next round, our ability to absorb higher technology rises. And we keep going up to a point where there is a certain critical mass that we get, that we start putting things on the table. So it becomes important for others to cooperate with us. So it is not putting this in separate compartments, we should only have self-reliance or we should have only collaboration. That is not the way the world works. So I think we should internalize that. It's necessary for us to be able to collaborate as well as build up our own capacities. These are not two mutually exclusive things. Reference has been made to fusion. I perhaps did not go into detail, but one of the first things that happened after 2004, in December 2004, we signed a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union. And so the first resumption of cooperation with a Western partner after 1974 was not with the United States of America. It was with the European Union. In that strategic partnership, agreement was reached for setting up an energy panel, which was headed by the Director General of Energy on the EU side and the Foreign Secretary of India on the Indian side. And if you look at that agenda, for the first time, nuclear energy is mentioned there. That was also the time when the European Union agreed to invite India to become a part of the ITER project, the nuclear fusion project that we are talking about. And India today is a very important member of that project. A lot of the very sophisticated fabrication of some of the items required for that fusion project are made in India, in the fast breeder reactor program that we have. So it's not that we are not we are not doing anything with respect to some of these cutting edge technologies. So I just wanted to reassure you that nobody is ignorant in respect to pursuing some of these very promising technologies. I think there was Mr. Commander Batra had raised the issue. Sorry, Batra Sahab, I lost track of what you were asking.
No, I simply asked George Bush.
George. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me tell you that my experience, several meetings that Prime Minister had with President Bush, he certainly did not come across as a person who did not know English. He was an extremely focused and intelligent leader. You may disagree with some of the things that he did. Fortunately, he did things for India which proved to be very, very important for us at a critical time. What were the reasons why he put his personal credibility on line with respect to this initiative? In his own words, he said, here is a country which is a democracy. It's a liberal democracy. Today, liberal, plural democracies like the US and India are under assault. We need to work together to preserve the space for liberal, plural democracies. And for that reason, India and the US must work together. Now, you may disagree, this is a certain fascination with democracy, but he believed it very genuine. Secondly, for him, the nuclear deal was not about nuclear reactors. So let me recall to you a conversation which took place in 2008 when the deal had gone through the Congress. In fact, President Bush was very preoccupied with the economic and financial crisis which had broken at that time. And yet he found time to receive the Prime Minister and to have a private dinner for him in the White House. During that dinner, where with President Bush, Vice President Cheney was present, Condoleezza Rice was present, Steve Hadley was present. We had a small group on our side. In the course of the conversation, when we had congratulated each other for success in getting this legislation through, Condoleezza Rice said, Mr. Prime Minister, the US has done a lot of heavy lifting on your behalf to get this legislation through, to get this deal through. I hope that American businesses will be able to profit from that and American nuclear plants can be sold to India. He stopped her in mid-sentence and said, I do not care if there is not even one single nuclear reactor sold by the United States to India. For me, this was not about selling nuclear reactors to India. This was about our relationship. So, whatever be his other faults, whatever be other mistakes he would have made, I am very happy that actually, as far as India was concerned, he had no doubts in his mind that this was, in his own words, one of the most important relationships for the US.
Mr. Saran, I have a question. Just one.
I'll come back.
Just sit down, madam, once again, I'll come back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things that I wanted to do today was, in fact, to draw attention to the fact that, much of what we do is very, very hard work, sometimes very unglamorous work, But without that, most of the bright lights that you see would not be possible. I have no doubt in my mind that if we had not undertaken the kind of very intensive diplomacy that we did, we would not have got this deal through. So it's very important that the leaders gave the lead, but a lot of the groundwork, nuts and bolts, were done by professional diplomats. So whether that is being carried through, I have no reason to believe it would not be, because I think it is not only with respect to this initiative that there has been intensive diplomacy. There have been a number of other occasions where we have been also witness to that kind of diplomacy. Look at what the diplomacy that had to be engaged in 1971. So it's not something which I would not like to leave the impression that this was something very unusual and it was only the special group of people who were able to do this. No, this is part of, I believe, the culture of our Ministry of External Affairs. Not always appreciated because it is not always visible. So I would leave it at that way.
Okay, I'll take the last round. You, sir, quickly.
Yeah.
But 1 second before you start. We have now reached the Twitter phase of our evening. So your comments and questions are 140 characters. Please go on.
Sir, a very quick question about a comparison between Team Modi and Team Manmohan Singh. When in 2008 you were achieving heights of glory as far as international nuclear negotiations are concerned, at the same time in 2008 we also faced some of the most outrageous incidents of violence and terror attacks on India, especially 26/11 for example. I want to ask you, was there, on the one hand you have these amazing diplomatic breakthroughs, on the other hand you have these hard security setbacks. Today under Team Modi, we find as if India is focusing a little more strongly on hard security factors, and you also talked about that the factors that brought India and US together exist, the compelling reasons that brought the nuclear deal together continue to exist, but we don't see that sort of focus on international nuclear issues anymore. Do you think that we have sort of left that focus on international nuclear negotiations and diplomacy behind and focusing more on hard security issues?
Thank you. Madam, you have the mic, so I'll give it to you for the last.
I think, as I can see, that the diplomats and parliamentarians are working antithetically with each other, because there is an organization called the PNND, Parliamentarians for Non-Nuclear Disarmament, working from Switzerland. And they have recently organized a global wave against nuclear countries. Now, there's been a signature campaign which has been celebrated earlier this year in New York City with the UN endorsing it, that countries, parliamentarians do not want nuclear proliferation, they want total disarmament. Am I correct?
Thank you.
It would not be correct to say that India has somehow moved away from its espousal of nuclear disarmament. In fact, even when the nuclear test took place, if you look at the draft nuclear doctrine that was drafted thereafter, it says that India believes that its security will be enhanced, not diminished, in a world which is free of nuclear weapons. So the commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons continues to be a major tenet of India's foreign policy. It is another matter that we also say that if you want us to unilaterally disarm, that's not good for India's security. So as long as the rest of the world is willing to work together with us towards realizing the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons, India would certainly not be found wanting, and India was in fact one of the first countries to very warmly welcome the Prague initiative of President Obama, where he said, we must put nuclear disarmament back on the agenda. We said yes. we would be very, very supportive of that initiative. It's another matter that that initiative has run out of steam, but certainly there is no contradiction as far as I'm concerned with respect to nuclear disarmament and our current security policies. With respect to the difference between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, these are two different leadership styles. It is very easy to see that these are two different kinds of leaders. But whether they are more focused on hard security issues, and we blame the previous government for not being focused on security issues, I do not think that on the ground there is a very big difference. Maybe in the articulation of what the challenges are, there may be some difference. But look at the one important initiative that we have been talking about today, and which is the relationship with the United States. Now, given the negative legacy here of the visa denial to Prime Minister Modi by the United States, who would have expected that he would actually be taking the lead even more than the previous government in actually forging much closer relationship with the United States. When Manmohan Singh came in as Prime Minister, people did not expect him to continue with the kind of policies of seeking closer relationship with the United States, which Prime Minister Vajpayee had inaugurated. He's the one who talked about US being a natural ally of India. It is under his government that we started the NSSP. NSSP was negotiated between Rajesh Mishra and Condoleezza Rice. So those initiatives were not only carried through by the Manmohan Singh government, but as we saw, they were actually upgraded by the Congress government. We are seeing something similar with respect to the Modi government. That not only have they taken on the initiatives which were taken by the previous government, but they have taken it to a much higher level. Even the nuclear deal, which the BJP unfortunately opposed during the Congress government. Here is a Prime Minister who has no hesitation in forgetting about what they must have said before and saying, yes, this is an initiative which has transformed India-US relations. He is the one who worked out with President Bush, and from what I hear, this was actually an initiative taken by the two leaders themselves, to really put the whole nuclear liability issue behind us. So in a sense, the completion of that initiative has been taken by the Modi government. So I think, yes, there may be some differences in nuances, in styles, but I am a great believer in the sort of continuities of India's foreign policy. Major departures are usually not possible, and if they are, you should be suspicious of them.
Thank you. On that note, I know that some of you, when we started this evening, said what time will we conclude. And I promised you, I said that our events will now be 90 minutes, from 7 p.m. to 8:30. So I do want to apologize to those who couldn't ask their questions, but Ambassador Saran has very kindly agreed to respond. So my request to those of you who have the diligence to follow up your questions, please email them to us at the SPS ID that you have. And I promise Ambassador Saran in a few days will give you a response. But I want to pick up 2 points that he made, and I'm saying this really for the benefit of our younger researchers and students whom I recognize here from various universities and think tanks. That when we look back, the statement made by Condi Rice at that dinner, the United States did most of the heavy lifting as far as the agreement was concerned. I think that is an assertion that we should acknowledge. More than that, I think there was a certain concatenation of time and interlocutors. Meaning that if India had really lost that window, when we had President Bush in the White House, because he had voiced this for Commander Batra's benefit and others who raised this point, if you read some of the American recall and the Vulcans, for instance, and what were the big issues, that the Bush team was looking at even before he entered the White House, India had figured. This was late 2000, early 2001. Then you have 9/11, and the entire US and White House focus gets deflected. Anecdotally, what I've heard is that December 2004, the tsunami, and India's response at that tsunami brought India back onto the White House radar in a very favorable way. And for our younger researchers, you might want to look at Ms. Condi Rice's speech in Tokyo, the Sophia University speech of March 2005, if I remember right, which gives you the first sort of sense where you discern that there would be some kind of reference to this. But this is really for the purposes of our researchers and the students who are following this, the role played by the US and all their officials, and of course the Indian side. I just want to thank Ambassador Saran for, I think, spending the time. I know now, having engaged with him for some time, that he does an enormous amount of homework. I will share the text with those of you who would like to have it. It's almost 5,000 words. Sir, may I, on behalf of this entire audience, it's almost 8:30. We haven't lost too many people, so I think that's a reflection of the interest that has been generated. May I also acknowledge and recognize the media which is here, as also the diplomatic community for spending your evening with us. And particularly, I want to thank this extended SPS fraternity and the Habitat, if I may. We have a lot of students here, South Asia University, Ashoka, and other, I would say, places of learning in the city. I'm glad you're here. We have a forum, the cyber forum of both the SPS and the South Asia Monitor. So I'd encourage you, if you have anything to share, please write, please let us know. And we'll do this again as part of the Changing Asia series. And on that, I'd like to recognize and acknowledge Director Rakesh Kakad of the Habitat Center, who has very consistently supported us on this effort. So on that note, I promised you before 8:30, those who have to catch flights, those who have to catch trains. Thank you very much for being here, and we'll do this again. Ambassador, thank you very much.